It is a powerful friend. This is a counterintuitive statement, but it is the central truth of Canadian foreign policy in the 21st century. On the grand chessboard of global politics, nations are defined by the choices they make. But what happens when a nation stops making its own choices? What happens when its default response is to simply copy the moves of the player next to it? This is the nature of the sovereignty trap. It is a subtle, corrosive process. It occurs when a middle power, in a well-intentioned effort to maintain a close alliance, gradually cedes its ability to act independently. It is a trap that is not sprung with force, but with the quiet logic of dependency. The nation becomes predictable. Its reactions can be calculated in advance. And in geopolitics, predictability is a critical vulnerability. For decades, Canada's foreign policy has been defined by a core principle: alignment with the United States. This is often framed as a strategic partnership, a union of shared values. But what was once a strategy has ossified into a habit, a dangerous habit of performative alignment. It is the act of aligning for the sake of appearing aligned, often without a rigorous analysis of Canada's own distinct national interests. We see this in voting patterns at the United Nations, where Canada's votes align with the U.S. position between 80 and 90% of the time. We saw it most starkly in the arrest of Huawei's Meng Wanzhou, a move initiated by a U.S. request that plunged Ottawa into a diplomatic crisis with Beijing, for which Canada paid the price. This habit is not a strategy, it is the abdication of strategy. The recent tariff dispute involving electric vehicles and canola is not an isolated incident. It is the latest and perhaps the clearest symptom of this deep-seated strategic ailment. To understand how this trap works and how Canada can escape it, we must dissect the sequence of events with clinical precision. We must analyze the moves made by Washington, the reactive copy by Ottawa, and the calculated counter move by Beijing, because this case study reveals the blueprint of how a middle power loses the game before it has even decided how to play. The price of alignment, a case study. It begins with an action by a great power driven entirely by its own domestic logic. Phase 1. The action of the United States. In the political climate of 2024, Washington faced immense pressure. A combination of domestic manufacturing concerns, national security anxieties, and the relentless pace of a presidential election cycle created a perfect storm. The target was the burgeoning electric vehicle industry of China. U.S. policymakers viewed the flood of affordable Chinese EVs not just as economic competition, but as a strategic threat to the American industrial base. The response was therefore not subtle. It was a show of force. On October 1st, 2024, the White House imposed a 100% tariff on all Chinese-made electric vehicles. This was not a policy designed for nuance. It was a wall designed to send an unambiguous message. The motive was purely America-centric. It was about protecting factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. It was about fulfilling campaign promises. It was about asserting American economic dominance. The potential collateral damage to its allies, including its northern neighbor, was, at best, a secondary consideration. This is the prerogative of a great power. It acts in its own interest and expects others to adapt. And so the first move was placed on the board, a move that would trigger a predictable and ultimately costly reaction from Ottawa. Phase 2. The reaction of Canada. For Canada, the American tariff wall presented a dilemma. But it was a dilemma viewed through a very old, very familiar lens: the fear of American displeasure. Canada's economy is profoundly integrated with that of the United States. According to Statistics Canada, despite decades of talk about diversification, the U.S. still accounted for 73% of Canada's total merchandise trade in 2023. This is not just a trade relationship, it is a structural dependency. This dependency creates a powerful incentive for Ottawa to avoid any policy that could antagonize Washington. The logic, often unspoken in the halls of Parliament, is that failing to align with the U.S. on a major issue like China could invite punitive measures elsewhere, perhaps on softwood lumber, perhaps on steel. The memory of past trade disputes is long and painful. And so, Canada's response was not born of an independent strategic calculation. It was born of a defensive crouch. Almost immediately after Washington's announcement, Ottawa followed suit. Canada implemented its own 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. The stated rationale was to stay aligned with its most important partner and to prevent Canada from becoming a dumping ground for vehicles shut out of the U.S. market. But this rationale mistakes reaction for strategy. By mirroring the U.S. move, Canada became a policy taker, not a policymaker. It voluntarily stepped into the line of fire, assuming that standing behind the United States would grant it protection. This was a fundamental misreading of the geopolitical chessboard. It assumed that an ally's loyalty would be rewarded with security. It was an assumption that Beijing was about to ruthlessly exploit. Phase 3. The retaliation of China. From Beijing's perspective, the board was clear. A direct, tit-for-tat trade war with the United States across all sectors would be enormously costly for both sides. A more efficient strategy was required, a strategy of asymmetrical retaliation. The principle is simple. Do not attack your opponent's strongest point. Instead, attack their weakest, most exposed ally. China's strategists saw that Canada had willingly made itself that target. Beijing did not retaliate against the American auto industry. It retaliated against a sector critical to Canada, but largely irrelevant to the United States: canola. The counter move was precise and devastating. First came a 100% tariff on Canadian canola oil and meal in March 2025. Then, an even more damaging 75.8% duty on raw canola seeds in August. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Canada was and is the world's largest producer of canola, and China was its single biggest market. The wall erected by Beijing effectively severed that crucial economic artery. This sequence of events perfectly illustrates the failure of performative alignment. Canada followed the U.S. move, but it did not gain security. Instead, it absorbed the full force of the counterpunch that was aimed at the U.S. The very act of alignment made Canada the primary target. As a study from McMaster University argued, this tariff wall does not foster independence. It deepens Canada's dependence on the U.S. market by blocking access to the world's most affordable EVs, and in doing so, slows its own transition to a green economy. Canada got caught in the crossfire of a battle it did not start, all because it chose to wear an ally's uniform instead of forging its own armor. This outcome was not an accident. It was the predictable result of a flawed strategic doctrine, a doctrine that other middle powers have learned to avoid. The middle power playbook. Around the world, middle powers are caught in the gravitational pull of the United States and China. They all face the same challenge: how to navigate between these two giants without being crushed. But while the challenge is universal, the responses are not. An examination of other nations reveals a playbook of strategic options that Ottawa has largely ignored. Case Study 1. Australia, the assertive ally. Consider Australia. Like Canada, it is a member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance and a close security partner of the United States. And like Canada, its economy is heavily reliant on trade with China. For years, it faced immense pressure from Beijing across multiple sectors. Yet Australia's approach has been markedly different. It has demonstrated a capacity for assertive, independent policymaking, even when it creates friction with its partners. In 2018, Australia became the first country to publicly ban Huawei from its 5G network, a decision made on its own security assessment, well before it became a mainstream position in Washington. This move invited significant economic retaliation from China, which imposed steep tariffs on key Australian exports like wine and barley. The economic pain was real. At one point, Australia's wine exports to China fell by 90%. But here the Australian strategy diverged from the Canadian model. Instead of capitulating or simply waiting for the storm to pass, the government and industry launched an aggressive diversification campaign. As reported by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, while the China market collapsed, wine exports to the United Kingdom, the United States, and Southeast Asia surged. The industry adapted and survived. Politically, Canberra held its ground. It strengthened its security ties through the AUKUS Pact, while simultaneously keeping diplomatic channels with Beijing open, eventually leading to a stabilization of the relationship and the removal of the tariffs. The lesson from Australia is that strategic assertion, while risky in the short term, can earn a nation respect from both its allies and its adversaries. It demonstrates that a nation has its own set of principles and will act on them, making it a more complex and therefore more valuable player on the world stage. Case Study 2. Germany and the EU. The rules-based pragmatist. Now let us turn to Europe, and specifically to Germany. As a pillar of NATO, Germany's security is inextricably linked to the United States. But as an export-driven powerhouse, its economic interests are deeply intertwined with China, particularly in the automotive sector. Germany faces the same EV challenge as North America, but its response, channeled through the European Union, has been fundamentally different in its philosophy. Instead of a political decision to impose a blanket 100% tariff, the European Commission launched a formal anti-subsidy investigation in October of 2023. This is not a trivial distinction. It represents a completely different strategic approach. The EU's action is not a political statement. It is a legal process. The investigation, as reported by outlets like Bloomberg and the Financial Times, is designed to determine on an evidence-based, company-by-company basis whether Chinese EV makers are receiving illegal government subsidies that give them an unfair advantage. If the investigation finds evidence of such subsidies, the EU will likely impose tariffs. But these will not be a flat 100%. They will be countervailing duties calibrated to offset the specific subsidy received by each specific company. The estimated rates are expected to be between 10 and 25%. This is a rules-based approach. It is grounded in the established principles of international trade law. This strategy gives the EU a significant diplomatic advantage. It can argue that it is not acting out of protectionism, but as an impartial enforcer of global trade rules. It frames the EU as a defender of the international order rather than a participant in a chaotic trade war. This approach demonstrates that it is possible to separate security alliances from economic policy. Germany and the EU have shown that a middle power can protect its industries without resorting to the blunt, often counterproductive, tools of a great power conflict. What both the Australian and German cases reveal is the existence of a strategic space between capitulation and confrontation. They operate with a clear-eyed understanding of their own national interests. They possess a theory of the world that guides their actions beyond simple allegiance. It is this strategic clarity that Canada appears to be lacking. The pivot, a strategy for independence. But breaking free requires a deliberate pivot in strategic thinking. It requires moving from a reactive to a proactive foreign policy. It means trading the blunt wall of a tariff for the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The foundation of this pivot lies in embracing the tools that are specifically designed for middle powers, the instruments of international law. The alternative to Canada's 100% blanket tariff was not to do nothing. The alternative was to do something smarter. The alternative was to use the very tools that the World Trade Organization provides for these exact situations. These are known as trade remedies. They are legal, defensible, and internationally recognized. Let us examine two of these tools. First, there are anti-dumping duties. These are not broad punishments against a country. They are specific penalties applied to a specific company when there is clear evidence that it is selling a product in a foreign market for less than it costs to produce it at home, a practice known as dumping. To apply these duties, a country must conduct a thorough investigation, gather evidence, and demonstrate that this dumping is causing material injury to its domestic industry. Second, there are countervailing duties. These are the tools the European Union is currently employing. They are applied when a country can prove that a foreign company is receiving unfair subsidies from its government, such as preferential loans, tax breaks, or free land. Like anti-dumping duties, they require a rigorous, evidence-based investigation. The strategic advantage of using these tools is immense. By initiating a formal public investigation, Canada would have shifted the entire narrative. It would no longer be seen as America's echo. It would be seen as an independent actor upholding the rule of law. This approach occupies the moral high ground. It says to the world, we believe in free and fair trade, and we will use the established international rules to defend it. This makes it far more difficult for a country like China to justify retaliation. Retaliating against a political tariff is one thing. Retaliating against a legally justified WTO-sanctioned duty is a much weaker diplomatic position. This approach requires patience. It requires institutional capacity to conduct complex investigations. Canada has successfully used these tools in the past to protect its steel industry. The capacity exists. What has been missing is the political will to use it as a primary instrument of foreign policy. But this pivot is not just about being defensive, it's also about being proactive. A truly sovereign trade policy uses market access as a strategic lever. Instead of just blocking certain goods, Canada could be setting conditions for entry. It could say to any global automaker, you want to sell your vehicles in our market? Then you must invest here. You must build battery assembly plants here. You must partner with our research institutions. You must source your critical minerals, like lithium and cobalt, from Canadian mines. This is how a middle power transforms itself from a mere consumer market into an indispensable part of the global supply chain. It is how you build real economic sovereignty, not by hiding behind someone else's wall, but by building your own house with bricks of law, precision, and strategic foresight. Conclusion and resonance point. The game is too complex, the players too numerous, for such a simple strategy to succeed. For too long, Canada has been a reactive player, its foreign policy guided by the gravitational pull of its southern neighbor. The case of the EV and canola tariffs is a stark warning. It demonstrates that the comfortable habit of alignment is no longer a source of security, it is a source of profound vulnerability. The path to Canada's future prosperity and relevance does not lie in echoing the policies of its allies. It lies in the more difficult, but ultimately more rewarding, path of strategic autonomy. True sovereignty is not a status that is granted. It is an action that is taken day after day through courageous and independent decisions based on a clear-eyed assessment of one's own national interest. It is the courage to be different when that difference is what your interests demand. This brings us to a fundamental question for all middle powers navigating this new era. In an age of shifting global powers, is the concept of strategic alignment an outdated relic? And what is the single most decisive action a middle power must take to avoid becoming a pawn in a great power's game? This pivot from alignment to autonomy is not just a theory. In our next analysis, we'll apply this framework to the most critical strategic domain for Canada's future, the High North. We'll show you the Arctic Gambit, how Canada can checkmate Russia and China.